Of all the efforts to protect convoys in the world's vast oceans during the Second World War, perhaps none was more challenging than the Arctic convoys, sailing for the Soviet Union's northern ports, a trip that Winston Churchill called the worst journey in the world. Here, merchant seamen, Allied and German navies, and aircraft competed in extreme conditions over vital supply lines in some of the world's most dangerous waters. On March 29, 1942, the conditions of sea, weather, and combat on the high seas led to a desperate battle, and for the light cruiser, HMS Trinidad, a shocking turn of events. It is history that deserves to be remembered. A special supplement to the London Gazette, published in 1950, explained, "The safe passage of convoys carrying vital war supplies to North Russia was one of the chief commitments of the British Home Fleet from August 1941 until the end of the European War." The Imperial War Museum explains over 4 million tons of supplies are delivered to the Russians, as well as tanks and aircraft. These included less sensational but still vital items like trucks, tractors, telephone wire, railway engines, and boots. Even more, the museum continues, although the supplies were valuable, the most important contribution made by the Arctic convoys was political. They proved that the Allies were committed to helping the Soviet Union, whilst deflecting Stalin's demands for a second front until they were ready. The conditions for these convoys were brutal. The Gazette writes, "The Russian convoy routes, in contrast to the complete freedom of movement of the Atlantic routes, were restricted to the east and south by an enemy-occupied coastline and to the west and north by ice. The convoys themselves were subject to attack by surface forces over a large part of their 2,000-mile passage, to air attack for 1,400 miles, and to U-boat attack throughout their entire run. The severe Arctic weather added to their navigational difficulties during winter months, but they ran a greater risk of attack between March and September, owing to the continuous daylight of the far northern summer." Still, at the outset, the convoys, which ran from the United Kingdom and Iceland to the North Russian ports of Murmansk and Archangel, found success. The Gazette explains that the first, which sailed from the United Kingdom in August 1941, only 2 months after the German invasion of Russia, arrived safely, and by the spring of 1942, 12 more had made the passage, with the loss of only 1 out of 103 ships. However, from the spring of 1942, the threat of attacks on the convoys increased, for the Germans were already preparing to stop the flow of supplies to Russia, with every means at their disposal. Then came Convoy PQ-13. Convoy PQ-13 included 19 merchant vessels headed for Murmansk from Reykjavik, sailing on March 20th. The convoy's close escort would be 2 destroyers, HMS Fury and HMS Eclipse, and a light cruiser, HMS Trinidad. HMS Trinidad was a Fiji-class light cruiser, a class of 11 vessels named after British Crown colonies and dependencies. The class had been built within the restrictions of the 1936 London Naval Treaty, requiring that they have smaller displacement than the previous Town-class cruisers and no more than a 62-foot beam. Yet they carried the same main armament as the Town-class, 12 6-inch naval guns in 4 triple mountings. The vessels also carried 2 triple 21-inch torpedo tubes for Mark 9 torpedoes, the largest in common use with the Royal Navy. NavalEncyclopedia.com says of the class, with the same armament but slightly slower, they were less popular than the Town class and proved not upgradable in the long run. However, some had quite distinguished service. HMS Trinidad was built at HM Dockyard, Devonport, laid down on April 21st, 1938, and commissioned on the 14th of October, 1941, under the command of Royal Navy Captain Leslie Swan Saunders. Among the crew was Royal Marine bandsman George Lloyd. An accomplished composer, Lloyd had written his first symphony in 1932 at the age of 19, and the 1938 Oxford Companion to Music described him as a youthful prodigy. The website of the National Museums Scotland writes that George was only 26 when war was declared in September 1939. George enlisted in the Royal Marines as a bandsman. After basic training, George was immediately promoted to the position of leading violin. He was also asked to learn the cornet. In the Royal Marines, George studied gunnery before joining HMS Trinidad, one of the fastest and most technically advanced vessels in the Navy's fleet. While on board in 1941, Lloyd wrote a march that was adopted as the ship's official march. The website georgelord.com writes that when in action, the bandsman manned the transmitting station, situated deep in the hull of the ship, controlling the gunnery. Also on board was 21-year-old Ordinary Seaman Wallace Hughes, the son of a fisherman. Hughes acted as a sight setter inside the ship's A turret, which sighted based on information from Lloyd's transmitting station. Following trials, the cruiser began convoy escort duty with the Arctic convoys, escorting convoy PQ-8 in January 1942 and then the return convoy QP-6. The ship did patrol duty around the Iceland-Faroe Passage before being assigned to escort PQ-13. Hughes told the Imperial War Museum in 1992 there was a lot of Liberty ships at the time that had just come up from America with aircraft and tanks and guns, and we were escorting them up. The crew knew the passage would be dangerous. Hughes said they were submarines waiting for us there, and the torpedo bombers, Ju-88s from Bear Island. HMS Trinidad joined the convoy on March 23rd. The weather was already bad. U-Boat.net writes, a strong southwesterly wind had accelerated the passage, and the convoy was some 40 miles ahead of its scheduled position when it was sighted by HMS Trinidad. The weather would get worse. U-Boat.net continues, the night of the 24th, a gale sprang up from the northeast, and by the forenoon of the 25th, it was blowing force 8, with visibility varying up to 2 miles. For the next 36 hours, the gale continued, unabated. The weather was a challenge for a warship. Hughes noted that there was so much ice that a turret was frozen up so that we couldn't elevate or depress the guns, and we couldn't traverse. He said the shipwrights had to go up and chip the ice off. U-Boat.net writes that by dawn on the 27th, the convoy was widely scattered, and not a single merchant ship was in sight from HMS Trinidad or either of the escorting destroyers. Hughes recalled that we lost some in the depression north of Iceland between there and Bear Island, and they dispersed because the weather was that bad, and we went into snowstorms, and they lost quite a few ships. They dispersed, you see, and we didn't know where they were. The convoy was spread out over 150 nautical miles, and the escorts were trying to find the ships. Meanwhile, the convoy was coming under air attack. U-Boat.net writes that the forenoon of the 28th March was clear and sunny, with occasional snow patches. At 10:07 a.m., HMS Trinidad sighted a shadowing aircraft, which she engaged ineffectively at long range. The enemy wasted no time. Within about an hour, their bombers arrived on the scene. Hughes said that we was only 14 miles from the Finnish front, and there was nothing but dive bombing and bombing all the time, that we were there. U-Boat.net writes that HMS Trinidad was nearly missed by 3 bombs from an aircraft which dived out of the clouds, and between 14:18 and 14:30 on the 28th, HMS Trinidad was persistently dive bombed by Ju-88s, but she sustained only some minor damage from near misses. 2 of the convoy's vessels, however, the ships Raceland and Empire Ranger, were sunk in the attacks. But the convoy would soon face another threat. U-Boat.net writes that in the afternoon, the German destroyers Z-24, Z-25, and Z-26 sailed from Kirkenes in search of the convoy. Known by the Allies as the Narvik class, the Z-23 class destroyers were formidable vessels. While smaller than the Trinidad, they were faster, and their 4 5'9" guns were a near match for the 6" guns of the Trinidad. The Z-26, which had been commissioned in January 1942, was the flagship of Captain Xerxes Gottfried Ponitz, commander of the 8th Destroyer Flotilla. The night of the 28th, the destroyers came upon a straggler from the convoy, the Panamanian-flagged steam merchant Bateau, sinking it with a torpedo. Then, in a snowstorm with limited visibility, the destroyers came upon the main group of ships and were identified by radar aboard HMS Trinidad. Frank Pierce, serving on the bridge of HMS Trinidad, wrote in his 1982 book, A Story of Russian Convoys, German destroyers Z-24, Z-25, and Z-26 had come upon the British forces in drifting clouds of thick fog and snow. Neither side could see the other to confirm recognition until the range had closed to only a little over a mile. Abruptly, the fog cleared, and in a flash, Trinidad recognized the German ensign. Suddenly, all hell broke loose. U-Boat.net wrote that the fire was opened at the leading destroyer at 8:51 on the 29th. Pierce writes that each side, with 6" gun turrets capable of firing 15 miles, was looking down each other's gun barrels. Trinidad's aim was true. U-Boat.net writes that by 08:52, the leading destroyer, Z-26, had been frequently hit and was blazing amidships. Z-26 broke off, and Trinidad, anticipating that torpedoes had been fired, turned. Pierce writing that the ship turned in time to see the torpedo tracks pass dangerously close. Trinidad turned and fired at the fleeing destroyer. In order to finish the German ship, Pierce writes, Trinidad fired 3 torpedoes. Hughes said that as we were chasing up, we fired torpedoes, trying to stop it. And what they said was that torpedo 2 tubes were stuck with ice. Pierce told the Devon Herald Express in 1988, as we waited, we realized the freezing conditions must have affected 2 of the torpedoes, because they'd not fired. The 3rd was on its way, heading straight for the German ship, when it suddenly changed course. Hughes told the Imperial War Museum, "I wouldn't dispute it, but I thought it very irregular. But it could have happened, being a torpedo man, that the torpedo we fired to sink this German destroyer went wild and did a U-turn as we was proceeding." Gunner Jack Farrow told BBC News in 2013, "I happened to see this white wake coming towards us. That's a torpedo." And the captain or one of the other officers said, "That's one of ours." And of course, it hit us. Pierce wrote, "It had run amok, and with the whole of the Arctic Ocean in which to run wild, it headed straight for the cruiser. Captain, officers, and lookouts watched helplessly as the torpedo sped in to strike the ship amidships." Hughes said it did a complete U-turn and hit us right in the transmission station. Pierce wrote the explosion was enormous, tearing away 60 feet of the ship's side. The damage was disastrous, causing many casualties. The worst area was in the transmitting room in the bottom of the ship. The explosion had ruptured the oil tanks above, and all the men except for 4 were drowned in the fuel, which poured into the compartment. National Museums Scotland writes that George Lloyd was the last man to escape from the transmitting station after it began to flood with the ship's oil. 32 men were killed in the attack, including 17 men in the transmitting room, 9 of whom were bandsmen. The ship was in danger. Farrow said as soon as it hit the ship, it started to go over. The hull in on the sides, you could get 2 buses in it. U-boat.net writes that the ship almost immediately listed 17 degrees to port, speed dropping to 8 knots. All communication from the compass platform failed, and steering had to be shifted to the after-steering position. While Trinidad reeled, HMS Fury chased the burning destroyer. HMS Eclipse was behind, escorting another group of ships. U-boat.net writes that HMS Fury appeared out of the snow ahead at high speed, and for some minutes, chaos reigned in the destroyer screen. HMS Fury actually fired 2 salvos at HMS Eclipse before recognition. U-boat.net continues, "There followed a running fight in the snowstorm, the German ship making smoke and altering away wherever HMS Eclipse worked up on his quarter and open A arcs. The damage previously inflicted by HMS Trinidad prevented the German ship from replying to the British fire, except with occasional shots, which did no harm. Conditions were very severe. Spray, which swept over guns and bridge, immediately froze on anything it touched. Gun decks were icy and gunwales full of water and ice. Use of binoculars by bridge and director personnel was almost impossible. But just as HMS Eclipse moved in to finish off the Z-26, the Z-24 and Z-25, which had become separated, showed up. Eclipse was able to escape but was damaged by their fire. Like cavalry in a Western movie, they seemed to have showed up in the nick of time to save Z-26. But the damage had been too much. Z-26 was sinking. The destroyer capsized at 10:57, with a loss of 234 of her crew. HMS Eclipse had been badly damaged, lost much of its fuel, but was able to make it to Murmansk. Despite the gaping hole, HMS Trinidad survived, Pierce writing, able to limp on at 5 knots, making it to a Soviet port for repairs. By the time the last ship made it to port, 5 of the 19 ships of the convoy had been lost. It's unclear exactly what caused the torpedo to run wild, although it's generally assumed that it had a problem with its gyroscope, which might have been affected by the extreme weather. HMS Trinidad received temporary repairs in the Soviet Union, but was unable to get underway until May 13th, an ill omen. It was headed to the United States for full repairs. She wouldn't make it. Able to only make 8 knots, the ship came under attack by 20 Ju-88 dive bombers. The ship avoided most of the attacks, but 1 bomb struck near where the previous damage had been taken. The blast killed 63 men, started a major fire. By May 15th, it was clear that the ship couldn't be saved. The crew abandoned ship, and she was scuttled by a torpedo from one of the destroyers escorting the vessel. The ship had been in commission just 7 months. Seaman Hughes lamented, "Within less than 100 miles, we were sunk." George Lloyd had been traumatized by the explosion that had nearly killed him and had killed so many of his bandmates. Suffering from shell shock, he was discharged from the Royal Marines and was unable to compose music for 4 years. But he eventually recovered and went on to an illustrious career. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.